Before we begin, I want to pause and extend gratitude to a voice in our community, the Elixir of Life, who left a comment just a few days ago that inspired this exploration. They wrote, "The modern idea of stoicism, aka broicism, can seriously mess with your mental and emotional health. Joseph Foley from Unsolicited Advice has a very informative video on that if you haven't seen it already." And then they added something that struck me. "Also, just wanted to say that I think you are super underrated. The quality of your content is top tier. Keep it up." And finally, the seed. "Any chance you consider making a video on egoism? I think it is a very misunderstood concept. A lot of people think it's just about selfishness, but I see it differently and would love to hear your stance." Well, this is that video. Thank you, the Elixir of Life. This journey into egoism is as much yours as it is mine. Your curiosity found a match in my own, and I hope what follows rewards that shared search for understanding. Now, let us begin. There's a strange intimacy we share with our own thoughts. When we are alone, undistracted by screens, noise, or the obligations of others, something peculiar begins to happen. We return to ourselves. At that moment, what greets us is not always clarity or peace, but a mirror, often fogged, sometimes fractured, reflecting a singular question. What do I want? That question, innocuous at first glance, sits at the heart of a philosophical forest we rarely wander into: egoism. It is not arrogance, vanity, or the Instagrammed ego, but something more profound. The idea that at the core of every action we take, even the kindest, most sacrificial, lurks the self, quietly pulling the strings. Let's begin with a story. Imagine a man walking through a village in the 18th century. His name is Thomas. He sees a child fall into a river. The current is fast and dangerous. Without thinking, Thomas jumps in and saves the child. The town praises him as a hero. "Such selflessness," they cry. But later, in private, a friend asks, "What made you jump?" Thomas pauses. He isn't sure. Was it moral instinct? Was it empathy? Was it because the child reminded him of his own son? Or because he couldn't bear to live with himself if he had watched and done nothing? Egoism dares to raise a finger and say, whatever the reason, it was for you. That's unsettling. It cuts against our cherished belief in altruism. But egoism doesn't always scream, "Me first." Sometimes it whispers, "You always." It proposes that even the most virtuous acts may still serve the self, through emotional relief, social recognition, or an internal harmony that feels good to preserve. But before we recoil in moral disgust, we must ask, why are we so afraid to admit that we serve ourselves? In a world trained to see selflessness as purity and selfishness as sin, egoism becomes the great philosophical heretic. And yet, there is something undeniably honest about it. Unlike other doctrines that drape human behavior in noble robes, egoism insists on stripping it bare. It doesn't excuse cruelty, but it demands we stop pretending that kindness is immune to self-interest. Egoism comes in many shades. Psychological egoism tells us we always act from self-interest, whether we know it or not. Ethical egoism goes further, saying we ought to. The former is descriptive, the latter is normative. And between them lies a battlefield of debates, thinkers, and ideologies, each wrestling with the question, can we ever escape the self? In this video, we will walk through that battlefield, sometimes in awe, sometimes in discomfort. We will meet the likes of Hobbes, Rand, Stirner, and Freud. We'll stare at the self from every angle as if examining a sculpture we can never quite step away from. Because egoism isn't just a theory, it's a confession. To understand egoism is to dig beneath the moral masks we wear, and this excavation leads us not to demons, but to something far more familiar: survival. Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 17th century, didn't mince words. He looked at humanity and saw not angels, but animals, driven by fear, hunger, and desire. In his Leviathan, Hobbes describes the natural state of man as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Without structure or power to keep us in check, we would descend into chaos, each man for himself. Thus, society, government, and morality are artificial, built from self-interest. We form contracts, obey laws, and curb our instincts not out of goodness, but to avoid a worse fate. According to Hobbes, morality is not a divine gift. It's a truce. Now leap ahead 3 centuries and meet Ayn Rand, a name that stirs as much admiration as it does resentment. In The Virtue of Selfishness, Rand unapologetically defends egoism, not just as a truth but as a moral necessity. Her argument? That self-interest is the engine of human flourishing. She saw altruism not as noble, but as parasitic, an ethic that punishes the strong for the sake of the weak and demands you live for others instead of yourself. Rand's egoism is bold, industrial, and heroic. She believed the creators of the world, the inventors, the artists, the thinkers, acted not for applause but for the joy of their own vision. To deny that is to poison the well of human achievement. Yet Rand's egoism is too sharp for some. It slices away compassion, community, and even love, rendering them suspicious and dangerous. Is that what egoism really demands? Or is there a more nuanced voice in the shadows? Enter Max Stirner, the 19th century German philosopher who thought even morality was a ghost, a specter haunting the individual. In his book, The Ego and Its Own, Stirner declares that all ideologies, religion, state, morality, are illusions that enslave the self. For him, egoism isn't merely the admission of self-interest, but the celebration of it. Not selfishness in the petty sense, but in the radical assertion of one's uniqueness. Stirner's egoist isn't a capitalist titan or a tyrant, a free being who refuses to bow to abstract ideals. I am not nothing in the sense of emptiness, but the creative nothing, he writes. It is both terrifying and liberating. What unites all these thinkers is not agreement, but audacity. They dare to say what most only think in private, that beneath our moral facades, we act for ourselves. Whether for safety, satisfaction, purpose, or pleasure, the self is always in the room, even when we claim to be acting for others. But here's where egoism complicates itself. If every action is ultimately self-serving, does that make all acts equal? Is giving to charity the same as hoarding wealth if both are driven by inner satisfaction? Does egoism flatten the moral landscape into a desert where nothing truly matters except how you feel? This is where the philosophical soil becomes unstable, where the roots of egoism meet the abyss. Some have tried to escape this abyss by softening egoism, allowing for a rational or enlightened self-interest. The idea here is simple. Perhaps serving oneself doesn't mean trampling others. Perhaps we're better off psychologically, emotionally, even economically when we cooperate, are kind, and love. Not because it's noble, but because it works. This is where egoism begins to resemble something close to wisdom. Take friendships. We treasure them not for their utility alone, but for the joy they bring. Yet that joy is still ours. We love our partners, protect our children, and sacrifice for our communities, but these actions still tether to the self. They are meaningful to us, and perhaps that's the key. Egoism doesn't mean cold indifference to others. It means acknowledging that even our warmth is rooted in what those others mean to us. Freud, ever the explorer of the unconscious, would remind us that even our noblest impulses often mask darker motives: desire, repression, fear. You give generously not just to help, but to feel powerful. You forgive not out of virtue, but because resentment is too heavy to carry. Egoism, to Freud, is not a choice, but a structure built into the architecture of the mind. And so we come full circle. We started with a man jumping into a river, uncertain whether he acted out of goodness or guilt. We moved through Hobbes's war of all against all, Rand's clarion call for selfish virtue, Stirner's anarchic freedom, and Freud's subterranean self. And now, We return to that original mirror, no longer fog, but still difficult to stare into. What if egoism is not a flaw to fix, but a fact to face? We live in a time of performance, moral posturing, curated virtue, digital halos. We rush to be seen doing good, but rarely ask why. We share solidarity as a brand and compassion as a caption. Egoism doesn't condemn these acts. It just asks us to be honest about their origin. If you want to help the world, help it. But know that the impulse to help arises from your values, desires, and need to make sense of the world. And that's not shameful. That's human. Perhaps the problem isn't egoism, but our refusal to admit how deeply it animates our lives. We fear that nothing will be left without a naked, selfish will if we pull away the mask. But egoism tells us something more subtle, more daring, that everything we love, cherish, and give stems from us. And that does not make it less. It makes it ours. In a world that often demands we dissolve ourselves into the crowd, egoism invites us to reclaim the self, not as a tyrant, but as the origin, not as the enemy of ethics, but as its hidden author. The self is not the obstacle to meaning. It is the soil in which meaning grows. And if we're to live well, perhaps we must begin not by denying the ego, but by understanding it. If this journey into the depths of egoism gave you something to think about, if it challenged you or made you see yourself more clearly, consider supporting this channel. Like the video, share it with someone who enjoys ideas that demand reflection, and subscribe to Phi for more explorations into the human condition, where philosophy meets the pulse of life itself. This is just the beginning. Until next time, think deeply and live honestly.